Hi, welcome to Chapter 9. This is the last chapter of Unit 2. The next time I see you, we are both in the birth room together. But before we get to the labor itself, we have to talk about what you do in the weeks before the labor begins, because the work you do in those weeks is what shapes how labor actually goes. Let me start with the sentence that's going to anchor the entire chapter. Labor does not start in the uterus. It starts in the brain, and that is not a metaphor. That is physiology. The hormones that drive labor forward, oxytocin most of all, are produced and regulated by the brain in response to the environment, the emotional state and the perceived sense of safety of a woman in labor. When that environment feels safe, warm, private, supported, the hormonal conditions for labor are favorable. When it feels threatening, anxious, exposed, or out of control, the body does what it has done for hundreds of thousands of years. It tries to stop birth until conditions improve. This is why your calm presence as a doula is not merely emotional support, it's clinical intervention. Your steadiness changes the hormonal environment of the room. If oxytocin drives labor, adrenaline suppresses oxytocin, they're in direct opposition. When adrenaline floods the system, oxytocin production is going to drop. When oxytocin drops, labor will slow or stall. And when labor stalls, the medical system starts to intervene. And that cascade that follows is not the result of anyone doing anything wrong. It's the physiological consequences of the body that did not feel safe enough to labor. The Cochrane review of continuous labor support found that doulas reduced cesarean rates by 25%. Shorten labor duration, and increase satisfaction with the birth experience. The mechanism is the hormonal one I just described. A doula who is calm, prepared, and known to the client provides the nervous system some co-regulation that the brain registers as safety. That registered safety lets the oxytocin do its work, which is why the preparation matters. A doula who walks into the birth room as a stranger is significantly less effective than a doula has spent 3 prenatal visits visiting her client, who can name their fears, clarify their values, and rehearse the decisions she might face. The relationship built in those visits is not administrative. It's the mechanism of the outcome. In 1944, an obstetrician named Grantley Dick Reed published a book called Childbirth Without Fear, in which he described a cycle that has since been supported by decades of research. Fear produces muscular tension. Tension reduces blood flow and increases pain. Pain confirms the belief that there is something wrong, and that belief intensifies the fear. The cycle perpetuates and intensifies itself until it is interrupted. Fear, tension, pain, more fear, more tension, more pain. And here's the piece that comes from modern neuroscience. The neuroscientist Joseph Doula, whose research on the amygdala is foundational, demonstrated that the brain's fear center does not distinguish between a real physical threat and a perceived one. A hostile nurse and a predator trigger identical physiological responses. A bright, cold hospital room, the tone of a provider's voice, the monitor reading that looks unfamiliar, each of those perceived threats could activate the same adrenaline response as an actual physical danger. So suppressing the same oxytocin and stalling the same labor. The paper tigers in labor are real, and the doula's work in part is to interrupt the fear, tension, pain cycle whenever she can, by creating safety, by normalizing what is happening, by providing comfort measures that reduce muscular tension, by reframing sensation without minimizing it. That intense pressure means your baby is moving down. Your body is working perfectly. That is not denial of pain. It is an offering of a different meaning for the same sensation. And that different meaning changes the brain's interpretation, which changes the hormonal response. The most powerful interruption to the cycle happens before labor begins. By addressing fears prenatally, so they don't arrive in the birth room as unnamed, shape-shifting dread, that is the work of the rest of the chapter. And the foundation of the work is a skill called open listening. Open listening is not quite the same as active listening, which is a set of techniques: paraphrasing, nodding, reflecting content. Those are useful. Open listening is something underneath them. Open listening means staying genuinely curious about what your client is actually experiencing, rather than what you expect her to be experiencing or what you want to help her resolve. It means resisting the impulse to reassure or to refix or to reframe until you have actually heard what is there. Most doulas and most people generally are trained by their own anxiety to move quickly to reassurance. A client says she's scared, so the doula says, it'll be okay. That response is not support. Open listening means sitting with the I'm scared long enough to hear what is actually connected to. The client who says she is scared of pain may actually be scared of losing control. The client who says she's scared of a cesarean may actually be scared of being awake while someone cuts her open. The client who says she's scared of failing may actually be scared that her partner will be disappointed in her. These are not the same fears. They do not have the same support. And you can't find the real fear without staying curious long enough for it to appear. It looks like a longer pause after she speaks before you respond. It looks like, tell me more about that, instead of, I understand. It looks like, what is the part of this that worries you most, instead of, a lot of women feel that way. It looks like sitting with uncertainty rather than filling it. Now, the brain framework. You have probably heard of this one before. BRAIN. It stands for benefits, risks, alternatives, intuition, and nothing, as in what happens if we do nothing or if we wait. Most training programs are going to teach brain as a decision checklist. When a clinical recommendation comes up in labor, walk her through the 5 letters. And that is one valid use. But the more powerful use, the one most training programs are going to miss, is that brain is a therapeutic conversation tool. I want to give you an example of the coffee story. At a prenatal visit, your client says, I've decided to cut coffee out completely during my pregnancy. The surface response is, that's great, good for you. The conversation moves on, you've accepted a decision at face value. But you also missed the chance to understand what's underneath it and left her carrying whatever it was that she was actually carrying when she said it. So now let's apply brain, but not as a checklist, as a doorway. Tell me more about that decision. What made you want to cut coffee out? She says she read it was bad for the baby. What benefits are you hoping for? She wants to keep the baby safe. You do not want to do anything that's going to harm or hurt them. That's legitimate. Layer 1, fear of harm. Let's keep going. What are the risks? What specifically concerns you about coffee? She heard it can cause a miscarriage. All right. What are alternatives? Have you talked with your provider about this? No, she just stopped. Intuition, what does your gut tell you about all this? She says she feels like she's already doing something wrong and she's not even that far along yet. There it is. The decision about coffee was never really about coffee. It was about guilt and fear of inadequacy that arrived with the pregnancy. What would happen if you had 1 cup with breakfast instead of cutting it out entirely? She says she would feel selfish. That's the why under the why. The doula who responds to the surface statement addresses caffeine. The doula who stays curious long enough to find the guilt and the fear of inadequacy is actually doing the doula work. And that's the most powerful use of the brain tool. Find the why under the why and address that instead of just the surface. At 36 to 38 weeks, you do an exercise called the 5 fears exercise with your clients. You ask her to name 5 things that she's afraid about during labor and birth, and she's going to write them down, or you can write them down with her or for her if that's easier. They don't have to be rational, and they don't have to make sense. They just have to be what are her actual fears that are living in her body. Then together, for each of those fears, use the BRAIN acronym to explore what's underneath it. You acknowledge the fear, you provide information where information helps, you brainstorm specific support, and you sit with the ones that information cannot resolve. The point is not to make the fear go away. The point is to bring it out of the dark so that it does not arrive in the birth room as this unnamed dread that stalls her labor. A fear that has been named, that has language, that has a plan around it, behaves differently in the birth room than a fear that is still in hiding. There is a neuroscience concept worth naming here. It's called affect labeling. When a person names a feeling out loud, the limbic system actively associated with that feeling decreases measurably. Naming an emotion is not just acknowledgement, it is physiological regulation. When your client at 37 weeks says, I am terrified of losing control, and you say yes, and you sit with it instead of resolving it immediately, her nervous system is actually doing something different than it was 30 seconds ago. And there is a phrase that comes from this exercise that you will use in labor. We talked about this. When a client is in transition and tells you she cannot do this, you do not say just, yes, you can, or you are so strong. You say, we talked about this. You told me at 37 weeks that this would be the moment it felt impossible. You said the word terrified. You are right on schedule. That's not just encouragement, that is memory. And memory is one of the most grounding forces available in the labor room. And then the practical work, birth preferences, not plans. The word preferences matters because plans implies that you control what happens and you can't. What you can do is identify what our core values are and articulate what matters most and prepare for multiple scenarios. This chapter teaches you about the nest framework, which I love, and the and instead of but technique, which I use in every birth I attend. So read them. Practice them with your friends and your family and use them with your client. One more piece, because this is the most consistently underused tool in the doula's kit. Empower the partner. The partner is not the doula. The doula is not the partner. Those are different roles. But the partner who has been actively prepared, who knows what to do during a contraction, who knows 3 or 4 specific comfort measures that work for this person, is a much more useful, much more supportive partner than one who is standing in the corner feeling helpless. Teach the partner. Practice with the partner. The partner stays. The doula leaves at the end. The investment there matters. In the prenatal period, practice at least one comfort measure together with the partner in the room. Hip squeezes, counter pressure on the sacrum, the rebozo. Find the one that works for this body and rehearse it until it's automatic. Because in active labor, a partner who does not know what to do will default to watching. Watching is not wrong, but prepared hands are better. Also, give the partner a transition script for the moment the client says she cannot do this. The partner's instinct is often to reassure, you can do this, you are strong. And that just lands differently at 8 centimeters than it does over text. Teach them instead the, I am right here, what do you need right now, and then listen. Before we close, this chapter ends with something every doula needs to know before any client calls at 2 a.m. Reading the signs of labor. Pre-labor signs that labor is approaching in the days or the weeks before. The baby is dropping and mom might feel lightening, the loss of a mucus plug, or she might have bloody show, increase in the Braxton Hicks contractions, or a sudden burst of that nesting energy. None of these alone mean that labor is starting, but they tell you it is getting closer. Then there's true versus false labor. False labor, sometimes called Braxton Hicks, or for long periods of time called prodromal labor, are contractions without cervical dilation, without progress. The contractions are irregular, they don't usually intense, and they stop with rest. Labor contractions, however, are going to increase with rest and with movement. They're going to get longer and stronger and closer together over time. They're not going to stop just because you stop moving around. If she's unsure, she can walk for 30 minutes, and if they continue to strengthen, it's likely true labor. Then there's the 5-1-1 rule. When contractions are 5 minutes apart, lasting 1 minute each for at least an hour, it's time to call and go ahead to your birth center or hospital. That's the standard guideline for first-time mothers at full term. Second-time mothers often move faster and may be advised to go earlier. High-risk clients, or those with group beta strep, might have a different guidance for their providers. So know the protocols for each client before their labor begins. So read Chapter 9 carefully, learn the hormonal physiology, keep that calm presence in mind for your clinical interventions, practice open listening with the people in your life this week, and watch how often you reach for reassurance instead of curiosity. Walk through the BRAIN as a conversational tool with a friend's worry, and start sketching out what your 5 fears exercise will look like in your own voice with your own clients. And before you move on, ask yourself this question. When in your own life has someone stayed curious with you long enough to find out what you really meant? What did it feel like when you finally got to the why under the why? That experience is what you're giving your clients in those prenatal visits that prepare them for birth. I will see you in Chapter 10. We're about to walk into labor together.